Well, I'm back, a few months, a job change, and a fresh hard drive later. Truthfully, I was a bit torn on what I wanted to talk about for my first video back, and although I'm generally adverse to flavor of the week topics that most of YouTube finds itself buzzing about, the prospect of getting in on the Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite projected roster rush was just too good to pass up. Before anyone gets taken for a ride, though, I'm going to be operating on a small handful of ground rules, which really all come back to one overarching guideline: stay rooted in reality. While I don't think the Marvel side will actually live and die by the MCU, as it's not the only thing Marvel would do well to push at the moment, logic dictates that the MCU will take up a substantial chunk of the select screen. So much has already been said by people directly influential to the project. Furthermore, although I doubt anyone will want the roster to come in smaller than vanilla Marvel vs. Capcom 3's 38 characters, and certainly nowhere near as anemic as the CPS2-based versus titles, the move back to 2-on-2 will afford it a small-ish roster all the same, so I definitely won't be overshooting Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3's 50 characters either. After some deliberation regarding the realities of the situation and the kind of roster all parties will really want to craft, I eventually settled on an admittedly optimistic count of 46 characters. Finally, I made a point to keep the overall selection realistic. Make no mistake, some of my choices will be really out there, but this is a projected roster, not a fantasy roster. It's going to be what I genuinely believe can happen, if laced with a slight personal viewpoint. So let's get started, shall we? First off, as of this recording, there are 6 characters we already know about. 3 on Marvel's side, Iron Man, Captain Marvel, and Captain America, and 3 on Capcom's side, Ryu, X, and Morrigan Ainsland. With that established, I did say that logic dictates the MCU was going to take up a sizable chunk of the Marvel side, so let's get that out of the way in the interests of time. It's almost a given that Doctor Strange will be back for his second Marvel vs. Capcom stint. I also believe the likely timing of the release favors Rocket Raccoon's return, with no less than Gamera in tow, who probably has the most to offer a roster like this out of all of the Guardians. Following the MCU's release calendar, we can pretty safely plug in Spider-Man, Thor, Black Panther, and a pair of debuting Avengers in Black Widow and Falcon, the former of which I should point out would be an ideal character to carry Psylocke's playstyle into modern MVC. Throw in Daredevil, Luke Cage, and a returning Iron Fist for the Netflix crowd. Now we need some villains. With the Infinity War in the wings and the Infinity Gems as a core mechanic of this game in particular, let's bring in Thanos as a character that was pretty damn close to being good in MVC2 before a small handful of characters kind of washed everyone else out. Add Loki for fan appeal, and then Helmut Zemo to go off the board a little. Since Capcom loves their alternate costumes so much, they could even include his Thunderbolt Citizen V design as DLC. Going away from the MCU criteria, let's bring Taskmaster back. He's a fun character, and the comics seem to be setting him up to be relevant again. Now, to me, that still seems pretty light on villains, even if some of Steve Rogers' current personal baggage finds its way into his character here. It's probably the biggest argument against the validity of my Marvel side, but we'll see what happens. Assuming a 46-character roster, then, that leaves 5 spots on the Marvel side for fan service and one other initiative we shouldn't overlook when talking about the potential roster for this game. The Marvel Universe is a very different place now than it was when Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3 launched, and the all-new, all-different Marvel is something they will and should want to push here. One character that is glaringly missing thus far is, of course, Wolverine, and I believe Wolverine will be a part of this game's roster. Only last time around she was called X-23. Now, unquestionably, Ms. Marvel has been one of the breakout stars of the all-new, all-different Marvel, picking up the mantle left behind by Carol Danvers, the aforementioned Captain Marvel. Kamala Khan has been nothing short of a license for Marvel Comics to print money from her very first appearance, with her comics among the top sellers every month. This, of course, makes her one of the few absolute locks for Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite. With her abilities largely rooted in strength and proportion manipulation, expect her to be a functional heir of Super Skrull's moveset when the game lands. One of the more interesting facets of Marvel vs. Capcom 2 was its inclusion of 2 versions of Wolverine, with and without the adamantium skeleton. No, I'm not suggesting they include classic Wolverine here after all, or even Old Man Logan if we're going the all-different route. Rather, I'm suggesting that Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite do something similar with Spider-Man, with the second Ultimate Spider-Man, Miles Morales, having landed in the core Marvel universe following the events of this year's Secret Wars crossover. An immensely popular character in his own right, his presence in Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite should add to the game's core comic fan appeal, while also helping to make mainstream fans more aware of just how much has changed. Now, before anyone goes thinking I'm okay risking a riot by leaving Deadpool out, we'll plug him in here because he should realistically be a fixture in just about anything Marvel crossover related from here on in. And then for the last spot, we can go back to the MCU and retrieve the Winter Soldier, because next to the Punisher, he's probably the ideal choice to give us a proper balanced version of Cable. Before I get started on the Capcom side, obviously I have to address a certain aspect of this Marvel roster. Specifically, with the popular narrative being that Marvel is trying to replace the X-Men with the Inhumans, the relative lack of either on this projected lineup is kind of glaring. Personally, I feel that the wheels have more or less come off of the attempted swap out, with the Inhumans movie falling off the MCU calendar indefinitely, and the recent announcement of a full-scale X-Men brand revival on the comic side of things. It also seems that all around the attempt has been very poorly received among comic readers, and justifiably so. With that in mind, I still can't imagine that Marvel is feeling all that enthusiastic in pushing the X-Men in the mainstream either. I included Wolverine, yes, but I find that going about it this way is consistent with the "we'll give you what you want, but not necessarily how you want it" mentality that has surrounded the brand in recent years. I don't know, maybe they'll prove me wrong, but even if they don't, it's hard to look at it as that bad of a thing from a game design standpoint. After all, X-Men characters have traditionally ruled the Versus series like gods, and if we can get a more balanced game by keeping the likes of Magneto, Storm, Sentinel, Psylocke, and Cable off of the roster, you could pretty easily convince me that it's for the best. And let's extend that to Doom as well, since it's the same situation when you get down to it. Now for Capcom. I'll level with you, this could really be horrifyingly boring, but let's look at it from a specific angle. Last time around, Marvel used this game as a platform to expose characters whose stock they understandably felt was about to skyrocket within their brand. I've spoken on this channel before about Capcom's recent initiative to call dormant franchises off the bench, and this game has already been directly cited as a first step toward doing so. Interesting. And yes, this does make X's presence here peculiar right out of the gate, more on that in a bit. I'm not saying that every Capcom character announcement should be taken as a coincidental game announcement, but given the overall creative climate over there, I would say that any character that appears here has a much greater chance of appearing in a native franchise title sometime in the next year or two. That should not only make this roster more compelling overall, but for better or worse, influence it greatly. The tricky part here is trying to divine exactly what franchises Capcom imminently would like to revive, again, trying to stay realistic in so doing. The elephant in the room, of course, is Strider Hiryu. His appearance in Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3 preceded his underrated Metroidvania outing a year later, courtesy of Double Helix, and he remains a very popular character today, more for his Versus appearances than for his own franchise. With that said, I think it's more likely that he sits this one out unless another sequel on the way, as I just don't imagine Capcom will be interested in Motokikaku licensing if they can avoid it. Conversely, if he does show up, I'd take that as the most ironclad confirmation of a game in the works than any other character who could appear. I'm betting against it. The first question, then, is about Street Fighter representation, which I'm going to assume will be at a minimum from a company looking to bolster its other brands. We'll add Chun-Li, because of course Chun-Li will be in this game, along with a villain, Juri Han, and a newcomer, Rashid, who we can all safely assume was penciled in for this game the moment development got underway, since he's practically a Versus series character anyway. So that was simple enough, wasn't it? Now let's look at Capcom's other fighting franchises, noting particularly that any fighting series represented by more than two characters will most likely be looked at as an imminent favorite for outright revival. Right away you can put Darkstalkers in this box, per Yoshinori Ono himself making the effort to kind of push the brand on Capcom suits. Another one to watch is Rival Schools, whose lead producer recently started a hashtag campaign to gauge support for a possible third installment, and should have serious traction in today's Capcom. So let's say Shenko, Jeddah, and Dmitry Maximov for Darkstalkers. On second thought, I don't imagine Marvel is feeling the midnight bliss. Then how about John Talbane, who should be much better suited for a game like this than games in the Assist era of the franchise. Let Akira Kazama, Daigo Kazama, and Hyo Imawano represent Rival Schools. And now, having torn through half of the Capcom side just like that, let's break away from fighting games altogether for a moment and look at Capcom's actual pipeline as we know it. That actually doesn't tell us much, but okay, let's put Resident Evil on the menu. The obvious move here is to put Albert Wesker on board after a successful run in Marvel vs. Capcom 3, and then plug a new character in to represent the new game, but very little that we've seen of the new game actually suggests it would lend itself well to a setting like this. Instead, I propose having another classic character debut, say Claire Redfield, on the understanding that any fitting Resident Evil 7 character can step into this spot instead. Also, even though Devil May Cry is only represented here by a mobile game, it's safe to say the series isn't going anywhere, now of all times, and so that's good enough for me to bring Dante back. Without a pipeline that can really guide us, let's talk about Strider Hiryu again for a moment. Not as a character, but particularly what the character represents as part of the Capcom roster. The early 90s were a boom period for Capcom, yes, in large part because of Street Fighter II, but their entire arcade business was insanely prolific. Strider was one of those games that really helped lead the charge of Capcom's arcade presence outside the fighting genre for that era. More than that game, it's that era that truly demands a presence here. Captain Commando is certainly worth a look. With the Versus series moving away from assists, he no longer presents an absolute defensive option by offering up Captain Corridor at the press of a button, and the less crowded playfield should play well toward the fact that he does have some brawling ability under the right conditions. We can also keep Mike Hagar around because this new approach to the game should also be kind to grapplers, and frankly his is a character that deserves to remain relevant. Final Fight should be a franchise Capcom's looking at for a revival. Again, we're in need of some villains, and though we've already picked up some good ones along the way in Juri, Jeddah, arguably Hyo, and Wesker, there's certainly some representation to make up for on the Marvel side. Now, the great thing about taking another look at the Mega Man series is that Mega Man as a franchise, and X in particular, has one of the greatest rogues galleries of all of Capcom's characters. Out of all Mavericks, I've always been of the belief that Storm Eagle has the most to offer a fighting crossover. Maybe not so much now as before they got rid of assists. Oh, the potential for bird spamming. But certainly still strong for a rushdown friendly environment such as this. There's also the soundtrack to consider. For the next X villain though, let's not go with a Maverick. They've already said that X's story will play heavily into the game's overarching one, and with Ultron Sigma basically confirmed as the game's final boss, let's bring back the largely unresolved Dynamo to play a part as well, perhaps even as a prime instigator of the game's events. Better still, when written correctly, he could potentially go one-liner for one-liner with the likes of Deadpool, and who wouldn't want to see that? Of course, he also presents a playstyle very distinct from what you find from X and Eagle, rounding out the series' representation nicely without going back to the Zero well. If you're noticing the distinct lack of heavies on the roster at this point, that's not an accident. I've already ruled out a Sentinel appearance, and any heavies that are not Sentinels generally only exist in this series to get styled on by their smaller, faster counterparts. Still, let's afford to risk one by pulling a villain from way off the board in Star Gladiator's Bilstein. I thought long and hard about this one and in the end decided that this is the best chance of making a legit heavy work in MVC Infinite. So that leaves us with 3 slots to diversify as much as possible. Dead Rising 4 will still be a fairly recent title when MVC Infinite lands, so as loath as I am to bring in yet another MVC3 also ran, let's plug Frank West in. With 2 spots left, I think we finally see Yoshinori Ono's chance to strike, plugging Ingrid into her first ever Versus appearance. And for the final spot on the roster, it's time for my lone personal shameless indulgence. The very top of my personal Capcom franchise revival wishlist is Breath of Fire, and by no small margin. If there is no one Wolverine limit, and there is no one Spider-Man limit, then there is no one Ryu limit. Now I want to clarify, it's been 2 generations since the last Breath of Fire game, and 3 since the last good Breath of Fire game, so this is a franchise that would essentially be starting over fresh. As such, I'm not anticipating that they would pick any one particular version of Ryu from past titles over the rest. Rather, I see this as being more of an amalgamate version of the character across the entire series, but particularly drawing from 2, 3, and 4 for influences. Of course, badass Succession tech would have to be included for his supers too. So there you have my projected roster for Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite. I imagine we'll know sooner rather than later whether or not it's accurate, but I for one feel pretty good about it for the most part. Before I finish, I just want to take a moment to go into some honorable mentions that almost made the cut for this list, and would absolutely be my favorites as first in line for any DLC plans there may be. On the Marvel side, I almost included Ant-Man until I realized how light I was on villains and went with Taskmaster instead. Miles Morales narrowly won out in my internal debate over the Jane Foster version of Thor. Finally, the revitalization of the X-Men line. If it should prove profitable for Marvel, the new Weapon X series should provide a fitting home on this roster for the reformed, redemption-seeking version of Sabretooth that emerged from the Axis storyline, as well as Domino, who for some crazy reason hasn't shown up in this series yet. For Capcom, I would have loved to have doubled down on my Breath of Fire push by adding Ray from Breath of Fire 3, alongside Red Earth's Tessa, who has been friendly to these types of crossovers already, Dark Void's William Gray, and Power Stone's Ryoma, speaking of franchises that need a comeback. So what are your thoughts? How does this projected roster stack up to your own? As always, please like, comment, and subscribe, and let the world know how you see this game coming together. I'll be back soon, hopefully much sooner than this latest gap between videos. Until next time.